Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the sophomore album from Kimbra, titled The Golden Echo. In 2012, the world was rocked by a surprise indie hit that soared up the charts and would remain there for months on end. A song that would ultimately become the #1 hit song on Billboard's year-end charts of 2012. Capping off a year that in pop music has really held up surprisingly well upon any sort of re-examination. It was a level of success previously unknown to that artist, who had spent the previous decade quietly making very solid independent albums that had garnered him a fair amount of respect and real critical appreciation. And hell, the albums were awesome, he deserved it. Of course, the singer-songwriter I'm talking about in this particular case is Goche, and the song, you all know it, Somebody That I Used to Know. A song to this day that I really do like, and yet I can't even say it's the best song on that third album, Making Mirrors. But while he works on his fourth album, let's talk about Goche's collaborator on that song and the real reason why it works so well as it does. Kimbra, a New Zealand singer-songwriter that released her debut album, Vows, in 2011. And having revisited that album since, well, it's odd, I can tell you that. Kimbra's blend of retro glam, breathy vocals was a really odd fit against the aggressively chipper, jazzy indie pop. And when you throw in lyrics going for these cooing lounge singer entreaties with a real subversive feminist edge and an undercurrent of brittle instability underneath it all, well, you certainly got a unique and decidedly memorable performer, I can say that. And yet, despite a few missteps, I really dug the mess of contradictions that coalesced onto that album, mostly because Kimbra was the sort of singer that could still pull together a melodically interesting and yet very lyrically nuanced track. I gotta admit, I really dug that album. So you can absolutely bet that I was really intrigued about her newest record, The Golden Echo, especially considering the early buzz and reviews suggested that this album was even more of a mess than its predecessor. So I took a look. What'd I get? Honestly, pretty much exactly what I expected, and yet somehow a fair bit less enjoyable, at least to my perspective. Unlike Vows, where the mess at least felt cohesive and grounded by Kimbra, who was a solid fit for the musical subgenres that she was sampling and experimenting with, this album feels a lot more scattershot and a lot more in focus and a lot less good. In other words, well, I think I've got a firm grasp on the Golden Echo's intentions and themes and motivations. It's ultimately an experiment that doesn't work nearly as well as its predecessor, and it's a bit of a sophomore slump, I gotta say. So, okay, let's get to the main issue, into the spotlight immediately, and this comes in the instrumentation and the production. Most notably, the shift in style and genre. Where Vows drew upon the retro glam of the pop music of the 50s and the 60s, a pin-up aesthetic that Kimbra could easily twist into something very subversive, the Golden Echo goes for the R&B and pop scenes of the mid to late 90s, with callbacks to 70s disco on Miracle and 80s pop on songs like Madhouse, especially pop icons like Prince and Michael Jackson. Now, immediately this places me in a bit of an awkward position because, well, I've never particularly liked most of 90s R&B and all of its schmaltzy, underwritten, borderline cheesy presentation. But you know what? In revisiting a couple of early Mariah Carey albums, they did give me a little bit more appreciation for some of the material of that era, at least in terms of production and the lush instrumentation, and how really powerful some of the underlying sincerity in that music could be. Call it schmaltzy and cheesy all you want, but there was a heart there, and that kind of worked. And I can't tell you how awkward of a fit it is when Kimbra attempts to step in with her glitchier, characteristically unsteady, and slightly eschew production instrumentation. Now, in theory, this all could have worked. Her brand of subversiveness, it worked wonders when cracking the very porcelain face of early pop music in the 50s and 60s, when it had a lot of the same sincerity and high gloss to make it work. But 90s pop and R&B and the society that surrounds it is significantly harder to satirize musically, at least here, and many of the rough edges that Kimbra tries to interject feel very tacked on and lacking in cohesion, compared to, say, Janelle Monáe's attempts to show some of the darkness in her material on songs like Come Alive, War of the Roses. Fantastic song, by the way, go look it up. Where she injected elements of punk and hard rock to crack that facade on her album, The Arcandroid. Now, Kimbra tries for something similar with noisy, slightly more modern elements, and there are some songs where it mostly works, but more often than not, the mix feels overstuffed, clumsy, and lacking a lot of the depth grace of the source material, which makes the satire are a lot weaker. The noisy interjections of 90s music, you know what, you might not like them, but at least they feel cohesive with the monstrous heavy swell of the chorus. But the chopped vocal samples on Goldmine, the claustrophobic and very hollow production on Rescue Him, the painfully oscillating synth tone on Ever Loving Ya against that what sounds like a mid-range MIDI from a mid-90s adventure game, the inert keyboard tone on Love in High Places that seems to be trying to go for an Asian-inspired melody in a really overstuffed mix. All these songs, they just feel poorly assembled to me and have none of the driving melodies and force that used to give Kimbra's work a lot of energy and flair and passion. In fact, this is a much colder album when it comes to the melodic progressions and that energy, with only songs like, well, 90s music, the Passion Pit-inspired song Carolina, the upbeat disco vibe of Miracle, which is really executed surprisingly well, and the punchy, slightly glossier edge of Madhouse, giving this album a lot of forward momentum, mostly supported by the great bass lines courtesy of legendary bassist Thundercat. But you know what, considering this album already runs long and feels stretched at points, the lack of momentum throughout this record is a big problem, especially when the melody lines aren't always that interesting. Now, fortunately, the lyrics do step up to a fair bit of heavy lifting here, following in a very similar line to Kimbra's previous record as a slyly winking satire of the genre that she's choosing to embrace here. Less of the antiquated gender roles that she did in the previous record, and more of the nostalgic feelings that accompany the brand of music in like 90s R&B and pop, and how insubstantial and misdirected those nostalgic feelings can be. And the opening 3 songs are a very strong salvo here, undercutting the overheated teen love, the road trip to find adventure, and the 90s music that inspired it all, and showing the confusion and real uncertainty hiding behind these bad decisions. Of course, 90s music doesn't sound like its decade, it's not supposed to. It's a sign of the shallowness in the past never really sounding the same when reflected upon later, or holding the same light now, leaving a lot of questions whether or not that particular genre and that particular pop music was worth all that much attention in the first place. Now, these poor decisions, often rushed or played out too long, they're all over this record, inverted into dominance with the hookup, but with knowledge of the inevitable breakup on As You Are, or the heady yet very reserved quality in Love in High Places, or the ending of the Chase song Nobody But You, or the power trip of her useless and unfaithful lover's desperate apologies on Rescue Him. She's only taking him back because she can have that power trip, or played a little bit more straightly with these bad decisions on songs like Miracle, or the coming together duet of Ever Lovin' Ya with the American neo-soul artist Bilal. What's telling here is how these songs are framed. Kimbra's lyrics indicate that her narrator can be all kinds of vindictive or cruel, or making poor decisions, or even delaying good decisions until it's far too late. Well, that's nuance that the R&B of that era rarely had, and sometimes really couldn't need it. Hell, even the album's standout track, Miracles, is filled with images of surrendering to that overpowering wash of love instead of being an exchange of equals. But while there is nuance here, I often feel that a lot of these songs are played all too straight to be considered direct satire or parody. There's not a lot of a joke here, with Madhouse ultimately feeling like an 80s inspired and ultimately less effective version of Coming to My Head from her previous record. Now, the surprising highlight of this album for me came with the album's closing track, Waltz Me Into the Grave, a ballad with instrumentation and vocals very reminiscent of Mariah Carey, but lyrics with a real thick gothic flavor that could have been written by Morticia Adams, with completely appropriate symbolic parallels that really do add a certain grave finality to this record that, okay, it's a good closing track, I can definitely appreciate it, but here's the thing, and it's ultimately what knocked this album down really significantly for me: Kimbra's delivery. Her voice has always taken some getting used to, but I'll be honest, I really do love her rich, low to mid range that can be brassy and emphatic and soulful and really powerful, and yet she spends all this album in her baby voice upper range and falsetto, and her inflection just doesn't sound good over this brand of R&B production. Her attempts at fluttering coos and R&B inspired vocal runs, they just aren't a great fit for this production, especially when it becomes smoother, as her voice frequently feels squeaky, thin, and borderline really quite flat in this range. And the production often just does not help her enough here. And look, I'm guessing that's probably part of her point, subverting those traditionally sweeping vocals of that brand of R&B, stepping into something that with a voice that you wouldn't typically see in this subgenre, but it doesn't make the songs any easier to listen to, or any more tolerable, at least for me. Now, I'll admit, part of these are my issues with this album, that I'm just not a big fan of this subgenre that Kimbra's satirizing. But you know what, on that logic, I should appreciate the satirical elements even more. That should make it up for it. And lyrically and thematically, I definitely do, but at the same time, it doesn't make this album any less overlong, messy, thinly sketched, and really lacking in truly potent melodies, at least for me. I'm thinking here it's a 6 out of 10 and only a tentative recommendation. But more of a recommendation if you're more of a fan of 90s R&B and are willing to see a rather loose parody and satire of it. As for the Golden Echo itself, it's not a record that will sound anything else like anything else this year, indie pop or otherwise, and I can definitely appreciate it for its experimentation, but honestly, not for much else, so just keep that in mind. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or there's any other albums coming out this year that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.